She was there one moment, gone the next. Emma Rose Harrison, 3 years old, blonde curls bouncing, gap-toothed smile that could light up a room. She vanished from a backyard birthday party in broad daylight while a dozen adults stood just feet away. For 47 years, her disappearance haunted a small Pennsylvania town. The case went cold. The leads dried up. The file gathered dust. But the truth was hiding in plain sight the entire time, and when it finally emerged, it shattered everything investigators thought they knew about that summer afternoon in 1977. What you're about to hear will change the way you think about missing children cases forever. Because this story doesn't end the way you expect. And if you leave before the final revelation, you'll miss the most shocking twist in true crime history. So right now, before we go any further, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, because Cold Case Crimson is bringing you stories that will haunt you long after the video ends. And if you don't subscribe, you'll miss the follow-up investigation we're launching next week. Don't let that happen. Subscribe now. June 14th, 1977. Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone. Where children played outside until the streetlights came on. Where mothers traded recipes over chain-link fences. And fathers mowed their lawns in neat parallel lines every Saturday morning. Sycamore Drive was the heart of it all. A quiet residential street where bicycles lay abandoned on sidewalks and the sound of children's laughter drifted through open windows on summer evenings. The houses were modest but well kept. The neighbors were friendly. The crime rate was virtually non-existent. It was the kind of place where people said things like, "Nothing bad ever happens here." Until it did. The Patterson family lived at number 42, a modest split level with yellow siding and a backyard just big enough for a swing set and a plastic kiddie pool. The house had that lived-in quality that comes with young children. Toys scattered across the lawn, a garden hose coiled near the back steps, a clothesline strung between 2 posts, fluttering with towels and small t-shirts. On that particular Tuesday, the house was buzzing with energy. It was Jennifer Patterson's 4th birthday, and Margaret Patterson had planned the kind of simple, wholesome party that defined suburban childhood in the 1970s. 15 children, ages ranging from 2 to 7. A handful of mothers who stood in clusters near the picnic table, drinking iced tea and keeping half an eye on the chaos. Hot dogs on paper plates, a sheet cake decorated with Raggedy Ann, a kiddie pool filled with cool water to combat the humid Pennsylvania heat. The party was unremarkable, ordinary. The kind of gathering that happened in backyards across America every single day during the summer months. Emma Rose Harrison arrived at 1:30 in the afternoon, holding her mother's hand, carrying a wrapped present with a pink bow. She was dressed in red shorts and a white t-shirt emblazoned with a cartoon rainbow across the chest. Her mother, Carol Harrison, had fastened the buckles on Emma's pink sandals that morning, rushed through breakfast, and driven the 6 blocks to the Patterson house while Emma chattered excitedly in the back seat. Carol remembered every detail of that morning. The way Emma had insisted on wearing those particular sandals even though they were slightly too small. The way she'd bounced in her car seat, asking over and over when they would get to the party. The way she'd gripped the present with both hands, so proud to be bringing a gift for her friend. Carol remembered thinking how ordinary the day felt, how normal, how safe. Carol stayed for a while. She stood near the picnic table with the other mothers, sipping iced tea that was already starting to go lukewarm in the heat, watching Emma splash in the kiddie pool with children she'd known since birth. The air smelled of sunscreen and freshly cut grass and chlorine. Somewhere down the street, someone was barbecuing. A dog barked intermittently. A radio played softly from an open window. Everything felt normal, safe, ordinary. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Carol left. This wasn't unusual. The mothers took turns supervising these gatherings. It was an unspoken arrangement that had developed over the years as their children had grown and become friends. One mother would host, the others would drop off their children and return later to pick them up. It gave everyone a break. It gave the children freedom to play without their parents hovering. Carol had another child at home, Emma's baby brother, David, who was napping. She needed to get back before he woke up. Margaret Patterson assured her she'd keep an eye on Emma, told her the party would wrap up by 5 o'clock and that Carol could come back to pick her up then. It was the same arrangement they'd had dozens of times before. Carol kissed her daughter's damp forehead, told her to be good, told her to listen to Mrs. Patterson. Emma nodded absently, already turning back to the pool, back to her friends, back to the simple joy of a summer afternoon. Carol walked to her car, got in, and drove the 6 blocks home. She never saw Emma alive again. The afternoon unfolded exactly as it was supposed to. The children played. They ran through the sprinkler. They took turns on the swing set, pushing each other higher and higher until the chains went slack at the top of each arc. They played a disorganized game of tag that had no clear rules and no apparent winner. Around 3:30, Margaret brought out the hot dogs. The children swarmed the picnic table, grabbing food with hands that were still wet from the pool, leaving damp handprints on the paper plates. They ate with the single-minded focus that hungry children have, barely pausing to chew. At 4 o'clock, it was time for cake. The children gathered around while Margaret lit 4 candles on a sheet cake decorated with Raggedy Ann's smiling face. They sang Happy Birthday in that slightly off-key, enthusiastic way that children sing. Jennifer blew out the candles. Everyone cheered. Margaret cut the cake into uneven squares and handed them out on napkins. The children ate with their hands, getting frosting on their faces, their clothes, their hair. One little boy managed to get frosting in his ear. Nobody quite knew how. Mothers snapped Polaroids, the kind that developed slowly, the image emerging from the white square like a ghost materializing. They would later examine those photos frame by frame, studying them with magnifying glasses, scrutinizing every detail, every shadow, every figure that appeared in the background. Emma appeared in several of those photos, smiling, her hair wet from the pool, hanging in dark blonde ropes around her face. Standing beside other children whose names would be recited like a prayer in the months and years to come. In one photo, she's holding a piece of cake, her mouth open mid-laugh at something someone had said. In another, she's sitting cross-legged on the grass, looking down at something in her hands. In a third, she's standing near the fence, her back partially to the camera. That last photo was taken at approximately 4:15 in the afternoon. It was the last confirmed sighting of Emma Rose Harrison. But sometime between 4:15 and 4:45, Emma Rose Harrison disappeared. The exact moment remains impossible to pinpoint, and that ambiguity, that 30-minute window of uncertainty, would torment investigators and haunt Margaret Patterson for the rest of her life. Margaret would spend decades replaying those 30 minutes in her mind, trying to identify the precise second when everything went wrong, trying to find the moment she could have acted differently, could have prevented what happened, could have saved Emma. The children had been playing in the backyard. Some were back in the pool, their earlier hunger satisfied. Some were on the swing set. Some were running in lazy circles, playing yet another game of tag with rules that seemed to change every few minutes. The mothers were still clustered near the picnic table, their conversation meandering from recipes to television shows to the rising cost of groceries. They were relaxed, comfortable. These were women who had known each other for years, whose children had grown up together, who trusted each other implicitly. Margaret went inside to refill the pitcher of Kool-Aid. It was running low, and the children were always thirsty after cake. She walked through the back door, through the kitchen, to the refrigerator where she'd prepared an extra pitcher that morning. She was inside for maybe 3 minutes, maybe 5. Later, she wouldn't be able to say for certain. Time, she would discover, becomes elastic in moments of crisis. 3 minutes can feel like 30 seconds, or 30 minutes, or a lifetime. When she returned to the backyard, pitcher in hand, condensation already forming on the plastic surface, she did a quick head count. It was automatic at this point, a habit developed over years of supervising children, a quick scan of the yard to make sure everyone was accounted for. Something felt off. She couldn't quite articulate what it was at first. Just a sense that something wasn't right. A feeling in her gut that made her pause, made her look again more carefully. She counted again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She counted each child deliberately, pointing slightly with her free hand as her eyes moved across the yard. 14 children. There should have been 15. Margaret set the pitcher down on the picnic table and called out Emma's name. No response. She walked around the side of the house, checking the front yard, calling again. Her voice had an edge to it now, a slight tremor that hadn't been there a moment before. Emma? Emma, where are you? Still no response. The other mothers noticed Margaret's concern. They stood up from the picnic table, their conversation dying mid-sentence. What's wrong? One of them asked. I can't find Emma, Margaret said, her voice tight. Emma Harrison. Has anyone seen her? The mothers joined in the search, their voices rising in pitch as the minutes ticked by. They called Emma's name over and over, each repetition growing more urgent, more desperate. They checked the garage, its dim interior smelling of motor oil and grass clippings. They checked the basement, flicking on lights, peering behind the water heater and the old furniture stored down there. They checked the upstairs bedrooms, looking under beds, side closets, behind doors. Emma wasn't there. They walked up and down Sycamore Drive, knocking on neighbors' doors, asking if anyone had seen a little girl in red shorts and a rainbow shirt. Nobody had. By 5 o'clock, the initial concern had crystallized into something darker, something closer to panic. Margaret Patterson, her hands shaking, picked up the phone and called the police. The dispatcher asked the standard questions. Margaret answered as calmly as she could, though her voice kept breaking. Yes, she was certain the child was missing. Yes, they'd searched the house and the immediate area. Yes, the child's mother needed to be notified. By 5:50, Margaret made the call she'd been dreading. She dialed the Harrison home, her finger trembling as she rotated the dial. Carol answered on the second ring, her voice bright and unsuspecting. Hi, Margaret. I was just about to head over to pick up Emma. Carol, Margaret said, and something in her voice made Carol go silent. Carol, we find Emma. There was a pause, a moment of silence where Carol's brain tried to process words that didn't make sense. What do you mean you can't find her? She was here, and then we looked away for just a moment, and when we looked back, she was gone. We've been searching. We've asked the neighbors. We've called the police. Carol, I'm so sorry. Carol's scream could be heard through the phone line, a sound so raw and primal that Margaret would later tell investigators she'd never heard anything like it before or since. It was the sound of a mother's worst nightmare becoming real, the sound of a heart breaking in real time. Margaret heard the phone drop, heard Carol screaming for Robert, heard Robert's voice in the background, confused at first, then panicked as Carol tried to explain through her sobs. Carol and Robert Harrison arrived at the Patterson house within minutes. Robert barely managed to turn off the car engine, his hand shaking so violently he dropped the keys twice. Carol stumbled out of the passenger seat before the car had fully stopped, her face already pale, already collapsing under the weight of a reality she couldn't yet comprehend. Where is she? Carol demanded, grabbing Margaret's arms. Where's my baby? Where's Emma? Margaret could only shake her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know. I'm so sorry. The Millbrook Police Department dispatched 3 patrol cars immediately. By 5:45, officers were walking the neighborhood, shining flashlights into bushes and drainage ditches, stopping every person they encountered. Had they seen a little girl? Blonde hair? Red shorts? White shirt with a rainbow? Nobody had seen anything. By 6:30, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across Sycamore Drive. The quality of light was changing, that golden hour shifting into dusk. And Emma Rose Harrison was still missing. Officer Daniel Kowalski was a 12-year veteran of the Millbrook Police Department. He had a daughter of his own, about Emma's age. When he arrived at the Patterson house and saw Carol Harrison's face, saw the absolute terror in her eyes, he felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd worked missing children cases before. Most of them resolved quickly. A child wandering off to a friend's house without telling anyone. A child falling asleep in a closet or under a bed during a game of hide and seek. A misunderstanding about pickup times. But as Kowalski walked the perimeter of the property, as he listened to the mothers describe the afternoon, as he noted the timeline and the number of people present, he realized this was different. 3-year-olds don't wander far. They get tired quickly. They get scared. They cry when they can't find their parents. Someone would have heard her. Someone would have found her by now. The backyard was fenced, visible from multiple angles. There were adults present the entire time, and yet a child had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. By 7 o'clock in the evening, Kowalski had contacted the Pennsylvania State Police. By 8 o'clock, search dogs were en route. The first 24 hours were absolute chaos. Word spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By evening, volunteers were arriving from neighboring towns. People who'd heard about the missing child on the news. People who wanted to help. People who couldn't imagine the horror the Harrison family was experiencing and felt compelled to do something, anything, formed search parties. Organized into groups of 10 or 12. Each group was assigned a section of town to cover. They combed through nearby woods, flashlight beams cutting through the gathering darkness, calling Emma's name until their voices went hoarse. They checked abandoned buildings, an old warehouse near the railroad tracks, a shuttered gas station on the edge of town, a barn that hadn't been used in years. They waded through the shallow creek that ran behind Sycamore Drive, the water cold and murky, feeling along the bottom with their feet, dreading what they might find. They searched until midnight, until 2 in the morning, until dawn broke and they could search again in daylight. Carol and Robert Harrison sat in their living room, surrounded by police officers and family members. Carol's sister had come to take care of David, the baby, who was mercifully too young to understand what was happening. Detectives asked questions. Carol and Robert answered in voices that sounded hollow and distant, as if they were speaking from very far away. What was Emma wearing? Red shorts, white t-shirt with a rainbow, pink sandals with buckles. Did she have any identifying marks? A small birthmark on her left shoulder blade, shaped like a crescent moon. Had there been any custody disputes, any issues with extended family? None. Robert and Carol had been happily married for 6 years. Their families got along. There were no disputes, no conflicts, no reason anyone would want to take Emma. Any strangers in the neighborhood recently? Anyone who didn't belong? Not that anyone could recall. Millbrook was a small town. People noticed strangers. Nobody remembered seeing anyone unusual in the days or weeks leading up to Emma's disappearance. Did Emma know not to talk to strangers? Yes. They'd taught her, the way all parents taught their children. Don't talk to strangers. Don't go anywhere with someone you don't know. If someone tries to take you, scream and run. But she was 3 years old. She was trusting. She thought the world was a safe place, because that's what her parents had shown her. She was a baby. By the second day, the media had descended on Millbrook like locusts. News vans lined Sycamore Drive, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, thick cables running across lawns and sidewalks. Reporters in suits and carefully styled hair did stand-ups in front of the Patterson house, speaking in somber tones about the missing child, the desperate search, the grieving family. The story was irresistible. It had all the elements that captured public attention. An innocent child, a sunny summer afternoon, a birthday party, a neighborhood that was supposed to be safe, and a disappearance so complete, so inexplicable, that it defied logic. Emma's face was everywhere. Her kindergarten photo was printed on the front page of every newspaper in Pennsylvania. It appeared on television screens across the country. It was photocopied and posted on telephone poles, in grocery stores, in post offices. The photo showed a little girl with blonde hair pulled into pigtails, secured with small blue ribbons. Her blue eyes were wide and bright, filled with the innocent joy of childhood. She was smiling, revealing a gap where her front tooth had recently fallen out. It was the kind of photo that broke hearts, the kind that made people look at their own children and hold them a little tighter. The search expanded dramatically in the following days. Helicopters from the Pennsylvania State Police flew grid patterns over Millbrook and the surrounding area, their rotors thumping rhythmically through the humid summer air. Observers in the helicopters scanned the ground below, looking for any sign of a small body, any disturbance in the landscape, any clue that might lead them to Emma. Divers were brought in. They checked the creek, their hands feeling through murky water and thick mud. They checked the pond at the edge of town, a murky body of water surrounded by cattails and algae. They even checked the municipal swimming pool, though it had been drained for repairs weeks before Emma disappeared. Every basement, every attic, every garage within a 2-mile radius was searched. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the woods, moving slowly, carefully, looking for anything that might have belonged to Emma. A shoe, a piece of clothing, anything. They called her name until their voices gave out, called until the sound of Emma became a haunting refrain that echoed through the town. But there was nothing, no sign of her. No trace, no clue. It was as if Emma Rose Harrison had simply vanished into thin air. Detective Leonard Marsh took lead on the investigation on the third day. Marsh was 53 years old, a career investigator with the Pennsylvania State Police. He had salt and pepper hair that was more salt than pepper these days, and eyes that held the weariness of someone who'd seen too much human cruelty over too many years. He'd worked missing persons cases before, dozens of them over his 3-decade career. Some had happy ending, many did not. But he'd never worked a case quite like this one. Never investigated the disappearance of a child this young, a disappearance this complete, this many witnesses present when it happened. Marsh set up a command center in the Millbrook Community Hall, a drafty building at the center of town that was normally used for town council meetings and the occasional wedding reception. Folding tables were arranged in rows. A coffee maker that produced something resembling motor oil was set up in the corner and ran continuously, fueling investigators who worked around the clock. The walls were soon covered with maps of Millbrook and the surrounding area. Photographs of Emma were pinned up alongside photos of the Patterson house, the backyard, the neighborhood. Timelines were written out in marker on large sheets of paper. A growing list of persons of interest was maintained on a whiteboard. Marsh's first priority was interviewing everyone who'd been at the party, every adult who'd been present, every child old enough to speak coherently. The mothers were interviewed first. Each one was asked to describe the afternoon in as much detail as possible. What time had they arrived? Where had they been standing? What had they been doing? Had they noticed anything unusual? Anyone who didn't belong? Their accounts were remarkably consistent. The afternoon had been completely normal until it wasn't. No strangers had approached. No unusual cars had driven by. Nothing had seemed out of place. The children were interviewed next, and this proved more challenging. Young children are not reliable witnesses. Their memories are malleable, easily influenced by the questions they're asked. They confuse things they've seen with things they've imagined. They struggle with concepts of time and sequence. But investigators had no choice. These children were the only witnesses to whatever had happened to Emma. Most of the children remembered Emma playing in the pool. They remembered her at the party. But their memories were vague, fragmentary. When asked specific questions about what Emma had been doing, who she'd been talking to, where she'd been standing, they struggled to answer. One boy, 5-year-old Timothy Crane, provided the only potential lead. Timothy told investigators he'd seen Emma talking to a man near the fence. Marsh's pulse quickened. This was the first mention of any adult male at the party. What did the man look like? Timothy shrugged, his small shoulders rising and falling. Tall, maybe, or maybe not tall. He didn't remember. What was the man wearing? Timothy didn't know. Was the man inside the yard or outside the fence? Timothy wasn't sure. Maybe outside? He thought outside, but he couldn't say for certain. Had Emma seemed scared or upset? No. She'd seemed normal, just talking. What had they been talking about? Timothy didn't know. He hadn't been close enough to hear. Marsh pressed gently, trying not to lead the child, trying to extract any additional details that might be useful. Had Timothy seen where the man went after talking to Emma? No. Timothy had gone back to playing. He hadn't paid attention. The lead was frustratingly vague, but it was something. Marsh brought in a sketch artist who worked with Timothy, trying to create a composite of the man he'd seen. The result was so generic as to be almost useless. A man of indeterminate age, with indeterminate features. It could have been almost anyone. Other children who'd been at the party were asked about the man. Had any of them seen him? Had any of them seen Emma talking to someone near the fence? Nobody else remembered seeing a man. Margaret Patterson was questioned extensively about this detail. She insisted that no adult men had been in the backyard during the party. The only adults present had been mothers. She was certain of this. But the backyard was visible from the street. The fence was only 4 feet high, chain link, see-through. Someone could have approached from outside the fence, could have spoken to Emma without entering the yard, could have convinced her to come closer, to walk around to the front of the house where they wouldn't be seen. If everyone had been distracted at the exact wrong moment, if all the adults had been engaged in conversation or attending to other children, it was theoretically possible. Marsh knew that the most dangerous time in a child abduction case is the first few hours. Statistics showed that if a child wasn't found within the first 48 hours, the likelihood of finding them alive dropped dramatically. It had now been 3 days. Marsh expanded the investigation to every registered offender within a 50-mile radius. In 1977, sex offender registries were primitive compared to what they would become in later decades. Record-keeping was haphazard. Many offenders slipped through the cracks, moving from state to state, without anyone tracking them. But Marsh compiled what information he could. He created a list of 14 men with histories of crimes against children who lived within reasonable proximity to Millbrook. Each one was brought in for questioning. Each one was asked to account for their whereabouts on the afternoon of June 14th between the hours of 3 and 6. Most had solid alibis. They'd been at work, with family, in public places, with multiple witnesses who could verify their presence. 2 did not. The first was a man named Eugene Farley, 43 years old, living in a dilapidated trailer on the outskirts of Millbrook, surrounded by tall grass and rusted car parts. Farley had been convicted of child molestation in 1968. The victim had been a 7-year-old girl, the daughter of a neighbor. Farley had served 6 years in state prison and been released on parole in 1974. He was quiet, unemployed, and spent most of his time alone. He had no family in the area, few friends. He existed on the margins of society, barely noticed, barely remembered. When asked about June 14th, Farley claimed he'd been home alone all day, listening to the radio. He had no witnesses who could verify this, no one who'd seen him, no one who could account for his time. Marsh obtained a search warrant. The search of Farley's trailer was thorough and invasive. Officers in latex gloves went through every drawer, every closet, every box. They checked under the mattress, behind the refrigerator, in the crawl space beneath the trailer. They found nothing. No children's clothing, no photographs of children, no evidence whatsoever connecting Eugene Farley to Emma Rose Harrison. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Marsh wasn't ready to eliminate Farley from the list. Farley was asked to submit to a polygraph examination. He agreed, though he seemed nervous about it. The polygraph examiner asked a series of control questions first, establishing baseline readings, then moved on to the relevant questions. Did you take Emma Harrison? No. Do you know where Emma Harrison is? No. Have you ever been to Sycamore Drive? No. The results came back inconclusive. Not definitively deceptive, but not entirely truthful either. The examiner noted that Farley showed signs of anxiety throughout the test, which could indicate deception or could simply indicate that he was nervous about being questioned by police. Marsh kept Farley on the list, but couldn't justify an arrest based on the available evidence. The second suspect was more troubling. His name was Douglas Brennan, 38 years old, a maintenance worker who'd been hired by the Millbrook Parks Department just 3 months before Emma's disappearance. Brennan had moved to Pennsylvania from Ohio in early 1977. Background checks at the time were minimal, and the Parks Department hadn't dug deeply into his history. If they had, they would have discovered that Brennan had a criminal record: indecent exposure in 1968, attempted abduction of a minor in 1971. He'd served 18 months in an Ohio prison and been released in 1973. He'd moved to Pennsylvania immediately after his release, possibly to escape the stigma of his conviction, possibly to find new hunting grounds. On June 14th, Brennan had been working in Riverside Park, less than 1 mile from Sycamore Drive. His shift had ended at 3:30 in the afternoon. He claimed he'd gone straight home after work. But he lived alone in a small apartment above a hardware store. No one could verify his whereabouts between 3:30 and 6 o'clock in the evening. Marsh, brought him in for questioning. Brennan was nervous from the moment he walked into the interview room. He was sweating despite the air conditioning, fidgeting constantly, avoiding eye contact. Marsh had interrogated enough suspects to recognize the signs of guilt. But he also knew that innocent people sometimes acted nervous when being questioned by police. Nervousness alone wasn't proof of anything. Did you know Emma Harrison? No, never heard of her until she went missing. Were you on Sycamore Drive on June 14th? No, I don't even know where that is. Where did you go after your shift ended at Riverside Park? Home. I went straight home. Can anyone verify that? No, I live alone. What did you do at home? Watch television. Had dinner. The usual. What did you watch on television? Brennan hesitated. I don't remember, just whatever was on. Marsh leaned forward. You don't remember what you watched the day a child went missing? The day this whole town was in chaos? Brennan's eyes darted around the room. I don't pay attention to news much. I didn't know about the girl until the next day. The interview continued for 2 hours. Brennan stuck to his story, but there were inconsistencies, small details that didn't quite line up. Marsh's instincts were screaming at him. Something about Brennan felt wrong. A search warrant was obtained for Brennan's apartment. Officers arrived early in the morning, before dawn. Brennan answered the door in his underwear, clearly having just been woken up. His face went pale when he saw the warrant. The apartment was small, a studio with a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a main room that served as both bedroom and living area. It was sparse, almost monastically so. A mattress on the floor, a small television on a crate, a few items of clothing hanging in the closet. Officers searched for hours. They checked every corner, every crevice. They pulled up the carpet, checked behind the walls, examined the ceiling tiles. Nothing. No evidence, no trace of Rose Harrison or any other child. They seized Brennan's car, a 1969 Chevrolet sedan with rust around the wheel wells. Forensics went through it with luminol and UV lights, looking for blood evidence, hair fiber, anything that might connect Brennan to Emma. Again, nothing. Brennan submitted to a polygraph. The results came back as no deception indicated. He was either telling the truth, or he was one of the rare individuals who could beat a polygraph. But Marsh's instincts wouldn't let go. The timeline fit. The opportunity was there. The history of predatory behavior was undeniable. But without evidence, without witnesses, without anything concrete connecting Brennan to the crime, Marsh's hands were tied. He couldn't arrest someone based on instinct alone. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story, because what comes next will change everything you think you know about this case. And while you're at it, hit that like button. Show me you're invested finding the truth about Emma Rose Harrison. Weeks became months. The command center at the Millbrook Community Hall was eventually dismantled. The maps came down from the walls. The photographs were filed away. The volunteers who'd been searching daily gradually returned to their normal lives. But the investigation continued. Tips poured in from across the country. Alleged sightings of Emma in shopping malls in California, gas stations in Florida, playgrounds in Oregon. Each tip was investigated. Each one led nowhere. People were seeing what they wanted to see. A blonde child of approximately the right age became Emma in their minds. The human brain fills in details that aren't there, especially when primed by media coverage and missing child posters. The Harrisons held a vigil on the 1-month anniversary of Emma's disappearance. Dozens of people showed up, holding candles, standing in silence on Sycamore Drive as the sun set. Carol Harrison spoke briefly, her voice breaking. "Please," she said, tears streaming down her face. "If you know anything, if you've seen anything, please come forward. We just want our baby back. We just want to know what happened." Robert stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his own face etched with a grief so profound it was almost physical. The vigil was broadcast on the evening news. The footage showed Carol's devastated face, showed the candles flickering in the gathering darkness, showed a community united in grief and desperate for answers. But no new information came forward. By the 6-month mark, the story had largely disappeared from the news. Other cases, other tragedies, had taken its place in the news cycle. The public's attention had moved on, the way it always does. But the Harrisons couldn't move on. How could they? Their daughter was still missing. Every day without answers was another day of torture. Carol's hair turned gray within a year. She was only 28 years old, but the stress, the grief, the endless not knowing had aged her decades. She stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. She would wake up thinking she heard Emma calling for her, only to remember, with crushing weight, that Emma wasn't there. Robert threw himself into work, trying to distract himself. But he would find himself staring out the window for hours, his mind 1,000 miles away. Their marriage suffered. How could it not? They were both drowning in grief, and neither had the strength to save the other. They had bitter arguments about nothing, long silences that stretched for days. There were times when divorce seemed inevitable. But they stayed together, held together by their shared grief, by their shared desperate hope that one day, somehow, they would find out what happened to their daughter. By 1980, the case was still officially open, but had gone cold. The leads had dried up. There was nowhere left to search, no one left to question. Detective Marsh retired in 1989, but he never stopped thinking about Emma Harrison. He kept a copy of her kindergarten photo on the wall of his home office. He would look at it sometimes, at that gap-toothed smile, those bright blue eyes, and wonder what had happened to her. He'd failed her. He knew that. Somewhere along the way, he'd missed something, some crucial detail that would lead him to Emma, to whoever had taken her. He'd failed, and a little girl had paid the price. By 1985, the case had been officially classified as cold. The file was archived, packed away in a box that was stored in the basement of the Pennsylvania State Police headquarters. Emma Rose Harrison became a ghost story in Millbrook, a cautionary tale that parents told their children. Don't talk to strangers, don't wander off. Remember what happened to Emma Harrison. The Patterson house on Sycamore Drive was sold in 1982. The new owners didn't know about the connection to the missing child, and when they found out, they wished they hadn't asked. The house was fine. There was nothing wrong with it. But it carried a heaviness, a sadness that seemed to seep into the walls. Margaret Patterson never forgave herself. She moved away from Millbrook in 1984, unable to bear living in the town where a child had vanished under her watch. She moved to upstate New York, tried to start over, but the guilt followed her like a shadow. She attended therapy for years, but nothing could lift the weight of that afternoon. Nothing could change the fact that Emma Harrison had been in her care, and she had looked away at the wrong moment. Carol Harrison attended every conference, every seminar, every support group for parents of missing children. She became an advocate, helping other families navigate the nightmare of a missing child. It was the only thing that gave her life any meaning. If she couldn't find Emma, at least she could help others. But privately, in the quiet moments, she was dying inside. Every birthday that passed without Emma was agony. Every Christmas, every ordinary Tuesday that should have been ordinary but never would be again. Robert Harrison's health declined. The stress took its toll. He had his first heart attack in 1992 at the age of 51, his second in 1998. He survived both, but he was never the same. David, Emma's younger brother, grew up in the shadow of the sister he couldn't remember. He'd been just an infant when Emma disappeared. He knew her only through photographs, through stories his parents told, through the grief that permeated every corner of their home. He loved his parents, but he also resented them sometimes for being so consumed by Emma's absence that they couldn't fully be present for him. It wasn't fair, he knew. They'd lost a child. But he'd lost them too, in a way. The years continued to pass. 1990 became 2000. 2000 became 2010. The world changed. Technology advanced. DNA testing became standard. Cold cases were reopened with new forensic techniques. The Emma Harrison case was periodically reviewed. Detectives would pull the file, look through it with fresh eyes, but there was simply nothing to work with. No physical evidence, no body, no credible leads. Eugene Farley died in 2003 of cirrhosis. He went to his grave without ever being charged in connection with Emma's disappearance. Douglas Brennan moved back to Ohio in 1991. He was arrested in 1995 for possession of child abuse material and served 8 years in federal prison. When questioned again about Emma Harrison, he maintained his innocence, said he'd never been to Sycamore Drive, never seen the girl, had nothing to do with her disappearance. Investigators wanted to believe he was lying, wanted to close the case, give the Harrisons some closure. But there was no evidence, nothing that could tie him definitively to the crime. Brennan died in 2019 of lung cancer. Another potential answer gone forever. Detective Leonard Marsh died in 2007 at the age of 83. He was buried with full police honors. His eulogy mentioned his decades of service, his dedication to justice, the countless cases he'd solved. But those who knew him well knew that he'd gone to his grave, haunted by the one case he couldn't solve. The little girl with blonde curls who'd vanished one summer afternoon. By 2020, Emma Rose Harrison would have been 46 years old enough to have children of her own, perhaps even grandchildren. But Carol and Robert Harrison had long since accepted that they would never see their daughter again, never know what happened to her, never have the closure that families of victims deserved. The case was ancient history, a tragedy from another era, the kind of story that true crime enthusiasts occasionally stumbled across on internet forums, debating theories, arguing about suspects who were long dead. The world had moved on. And then, in March of 2024, everything changed. A woman named Rebecca Sinclair walked into the Millbrook Police Department with a story that seemed impossible. Rebecca was 50 years old. She had graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wire-rimmed glasses, and the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent most of their time with teenagers. She was a high school English teacher in Burlington, Vermont, well-liked by her students, respected by her colleagues. She had a normal life, a good life, but that life had just been turned completely upside down. The officer at the front desk initially thought she might be reporting a crime or filing a complaint, but Rebecca's first words stopped him cold. "I think I might be Emma Harrison," she said. The officer stared at her, not comprehending at first. The name meant nothing to him. He'd only been on the force for 3 years, and the Harrison case was ancient history. "I'm sorry, who?" "Emma Rose Harrison, the little girl who disappeared from Millbrook in 1977. The officer's eyes widened. He'd heard of the case, of course. Every officer in Millbrook had. It was part of the department's institutional memory, the unsolved mystery that had haunted the town for decades. "Ma'am, I think you need to speak with a detective." Within an hour, Rebecca Sinclair was sitting in an interview room, telling her story to Detective Sarah Chen, a veteran investigator who'd heard a lot of strange things over her 20-year career, but nothing quite like this. Rebecca explained that she'd been adopted as a toddler in 1977 by a couple named Helen and Raymond Sinclair. They'd been good parents, loving, attentive. She'd had a happy childhood in Vermont, had done well in school, gone to college, become a teacher, had married, divorced, married again, had built a life. Her adoptive parents had always been open about the fact that she was adopted. They'd told her from a young age, made sure she knew she was chosen, loved, wanted. They'd said the adoption had been arranged privately, through a lawyer, that her birth mother had been very young, unable to care for a child, and had made the difficult decision to place her for adoption. Rebecca had never questioned this story. Why would she? She had no reason to doubt her parents, who she loved and who clearly loved her. Helen Sinclair died in 2019 of pancreatic cancer. Raymond died 2 years later, in 2021, of complications from Alzheimer's. Rebecca had been devastated by their deaths, but particularly her mother's. Helen had been her best friend, her confidant. Losing her had left a hole that nothing could fill. After Raymond died, Rebecca had the difficult task of going through her parents' belongings, sorting through a lifetime of accumulated possessions, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to throw away. The house in Burlington was a modest colonial with an attic that ran the full length of the building. Rebecca had been putting off dealing with the attic, knowing it was packed with boxes and old furniture and who knew what else. But finally, in February of 2024, she'd forced herself to do it. The attic was as cluttered as she'd feared. Boxes labeled Christmas decorations, and Raymond's books, and old photographs. Furniture covered with sheets, suitcases that hadn't been opened in decades. Rebecca worked methodically, going through one box at a time. Most of it was unremarkable. Old clothes, kitchen items, things that could be donated or thrown away. But then she found a box that wasn't labeled. It was pushed far back into a corner, behind a dresser, hidden in a way that suggested it wasn't meant to be found. Rebecca pulled it out, brushed off the dust, and opened it. Inside were documents, photographs, and a birth certificate that made her blood run cold. The birth certificate was for a child named Emma Rose Harrison, born March 3, 1974, in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Parents listed as Carol Jean Harrison and Robert Thomas Harrison. The photograph clipped to the birth certificate showed a little girl who looked exactly like Rebecca's baby pictures. Blonde hair, blue eyes, the same slightly upturned nose, the same wide smile. Rebecca's hands shook as she pulled out more items from the box. There was a small white t-shirt with a rainbow across the chest, red shorts, pink sandals with buckles. There was a newspaper clipping from June of 1977. The headline read, "Local Girl 3 Vanishes from Birthday Party." There were more newspaper articles, stories about the search, the investigation, the grieving family, and a photograph of a couple identified as Carol and Robert Harrison, standing in front of their home, looking devastated. At the bottom of the box was a journal. Rebecca opened it with trembling hands and saw her mother's handwriting. "I don't know how to begin this. I don't know if anyone will ever read it, but I have to write it down." Rebecca read through the entire journal sitting on the attic floor, tears streaming down her face, her entire understanding of her life crumbling around her. Helen's journal told the whole story. Helen and Raymond Sinclair had wanted children desperately. They'd tried for years. Helen had multiple miscarriages. They'd applied to adoption agencies, but Raymond's history of depression and anxiety made them poor candidates. They were rejected again and again. Helen became obsessed. The desire for a child consumed her every waking thought. She would see mothers with their children at the grocery store and feel a jealousy so intense it was almost physical. She would cry herself to sleep at night, feeling empty, incomplete. By 1977, Helen was 39 years old. Her window for having children was closing. The desperation had turned into something darker. On June 14, 1977, Helen had been driving through Millbrook. She'd been visiting a friend in a nearby town and was taking a different route home. She'd never been to Millbrook before, had no connection to the town. As she drove down Sycamore Drive, she saw the birthday party, saw children playing in a backyard, and she saw Emma standing near the fence, alone for just a moment. Helen pulled her car over. She didn't plan it, didn't think about it. She acted on impulse born from years of desperation and grief and longing. She called to Emma from outside the fence, told her she had a puppy in her car. Would Emma like to see it? Emma, trusting and innocent, the way 3-year-olds are, walked over to the fence. Helen opened the car door, told Emma the puppy was in the back seat. Emma climbed in to look, and Helen got in the driver's seat and drove away. In the journal, Helen described the drive back to Vermont as surreal. Emma had asked about the puppy. Helen had told her the puppy was at her house. They were going there now. Emma had seemed content with this answer. By the time they reached Vermont, 3 hours later, Emma was asleep in the back seat. Helen carried her into the house. Raymond was at work. Helen had a few hours to figure out what to do next. She cut Emma's hair, cut those blonde curls short, dyed what remained a light brown, burned the clothes Emma had been wearing in the fireplace, dressed her in clothing that Helen had bought years ago in anticipation of having a daughter. When Raymond came home, Helen told him that a friend of a friend had arranged a private adoption, that the birth mother was very young and wanted the adoption finalized quickly, quietly, that all the paperwork would be handled by a lawyer, but for now, they needed to take the child immediately. Raymond was suspicious at first, questioned Helen about the details, but Helen was convincing, and Raymond wanted a child so badly that he let himself believe her. They named her Rebecca, moved to a different town in Vermont, claiming they were starting fresh. told everyone they'd adopted a daughter through a private agency, and they raised Emma as their own. Helen's journal described the guilt that consumed her for the rest of her life. She would see news reports about the missing child, about the desperate parents searching for their daughter. She knew what she'd done was monstrous, knew she'd destroyed multiple lives for her own selfish desire, but she couldn't undo it. And as the years passed, as Rebecca grew and thrived, as Helen watched her daughter learn to read and ride a bike and graduate from high school, the guilt became something she learned to live with. She'd convinced herself, on some level, that she'd saved Emma, that Emma was better off with her and Raymond than with whoever might have actually taken her, that she was giving Emma a good life, a loving home. But she knew the truth. She was a kidnapper, a child abductor, and the Harrisons were out there somewhere, their lives destroyed, never knowing what had happened to their daughter. Helen's journal ended with an entry from 2018, shortly after her cancer diagnosis. "I'm dying. The doctors say I have maybe a year, maybe less. And I'm terrified. Not of death, but of dying, without confessing, without giving the Harrisons the truth they deserve. But how can I? If I confess, I lose Rebecca. She'll hate me. She'll forgive me. And Raymond will know the truth about what I did. It will destroy him. So I'm writing this instead, putting it in a box, hiding it. Maybe someone will find it after I'm gone. Maybe Rebecca will find it and understand. Or maybe it will never be found, and I'll take this secret to my grave. I don't know which I hope for." Rebecca finished reading the journal and sat in the attic for hours, unable to process what she'd learned. Her entire life was a lie. Her parents, who she'd loved and trusted, had kidnapped her. Her real parents, people she didn't remember, had spent 47 years searching for her, grieving for her. She was Emma Rose Harrison, and she'd been living a normal life, completely unaware, for nearly 5 decades. Rebecca's first instinct was to bury the box, to pretend she'd never found it. Her life was good. She had friends, a career, a husband she loved. Why destroy all of that? But she kept thinking about Carol and Robert Harrison, about what they must have gone through, about the fact that they'd never known what happened to their daughter, never had closure. She thought about it for 3 weeks, barely sleeping, barely eating. Her husband knew something was wrong, but couldn't get her to talk about it. Finally, Rebecca made a decision. She'd taken a DNA test through one of those online ancestry services a few years earlier, just out of curiosity about her heritage. She requested that her DNA profile be checked against databases of missing persons. The match came back within 48 hours. Rebecca Sinclair's DNA was a familial match to David Harrison, who'd submitted his DNA to missing persons databases years ago in the desperate hope that his sister might still be alive somewhere. The probability of siblingship was 99.99%. Rebecca Sinclair was Emma Rose Harrison. Now, sitting in the Millbrook Police Department, Rebecca told this entire story to Detective Chen. She provided the box she'd found, the journal, the birth certificate, the newspaper clippings, the DNA results. Chen listened, her expression carefully neutral, her mind racing. If this was true, it was the most extraordinary resolution to a cold case she'd ever heard of. "We'll need to verify everything," Chen said carefully. "The DNA results, the journal, the timeline. We'll need to contact your brother, David Harrison, and your birth parents." Rebecca nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. I need to know for certain. And if it's true, if I really am Emma Harrison, then Carol and Robert deserve to know. They deserve to know what happened." The verification process took 2 weeks. The DNA was tested and retested. The results were conclusive. Rebecca Sinclair shared 50% of her DNA with David Harrison. She was his sister. The handwriting in the journal was verified as Helen Sinclair's through comparison with known samples. The timeline matched. Helen Sinclair had been in the area on June 14, 1977. Cell phone records and credit card data didn't exist back then, but investigators found an old appointment book among Helen's belongings that showed she'd been visiting a friend in Greenfield, Pennsylvania that day. less than 20 miles from Millbrook. Photographs of Rebecca as a child were compared to photographs of Emma. Facial recognition software confirmed that they were the same person. There was no doubt. Rebecca Sinclair was Emma Rose Harrison. Detective Chen made the call to David Harrison on April 2, 2024. David was 50 years old now, married with 3 children of his own. He'd given up hope of ever finding his sister decades ago. When his phone rang and he saw it was the Millbrook Police Department, his first thought was that something had happened to his parents. "Mr. Harrison, this is Detective Chen with the Millbrook Police Department. I need you to sit down. I have some news about your sister Emma." David felt his heart stop. "You found her body?" "No, Mr. Harrison. We found your sister. She's alive." There was a long silence. David couldn't process the words. They didn't make sense. "What?" "Your sister is alive. She's been living in Vermont under a different name. She was abducted from the birthday party in 1977 and raised by another family. She only recently discovered her true identity." David started crying. He couldn't speak. His wife took the phone from him, listened to Chen's explanation, and started crying herself. The next call was to Carol and Robert Harrison. Carol was 74 years old now. Robert was 76. They were living in a retirement community in Florida, having left Millbrook decades ago because the memories were too painful. When the phone rang and Chen identified herself, Carol's first instinct was also that they'd found a body. After 47 years, she'd long since given up hope of seeing Emma alive. "Mrs. Harrison, I have extraordinary news. We've found Emma. She's alive." Carol dropped the phone. Robert picked it up, his hands shaking. "Say that again." "Your daughter is alive, Mr. Harrison. She was kidnapped from the birthday party and raised by another family in Vermont. She recently discovered her true identity through DNA testing and came forward. She's here in Millbrook. She wants to meet you." Robert couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. This couldn't be real. It was impossible. But Chen explained the whole story. The journal, the DNA match, the verification process. It was real. Emma was alive. The reunion was arranged for April 10, 2024, at the Millbrook Police Department. Rebecca arrived first, her husband beside her for support. She was terrified. These were her biological parents, but they were strangers. She had no memory of them. No connection beyond genetics, and a few years of infancy she couldn't recall. David arrived next. When he saw Rebecca, he started crying immediately. She looked like their mother. She had the same eyes, the same smile. He hugged her, this sister he'd never known but had mourned his entire life. "I can't believe you're real," he kept saying. "I can't believe you're here." Then Carol and Robert arrived. Carol took one look at Rebecca and collapsed. Robert caught her, both of them sobbing, trembling. Rebecca walked over to them, tears streaming down her own face. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry I didn't know. I'm so sorry you've me all these years." Carol reached up and touched Rebecca's face with shaking hands. "You're alive," she whispered. "My baby is alive." They stood there for a long time, the 4 of them, crying, holding each other. A family torn apart by a senseless act of desperation, finally, impossibly, reunited after 47 years. The story made international headlines within hours. Missing child, found alive after 47 years. Emma Harrison, kidnapped in 1977, reunited with family. Teacher discovers she's been missing for decades. The twist that Emma had been living a completely normal life, under a different name, unaware of her own identity, shocked the world. It was unprecedented, the kind of resolution that seemed like fiction but was devastatingly real. The interviews, the media attention, the public fascination was overwhelming. Rebecca did one televised interview, sitting beside Carol and Robert, explaining her story. "I don't blame my adoptive parents," she said, though this was complicated. "My mother, Helen, she did a terrible thing. She destroyed lives, but she also raised me. She loved me. She gave me a good life. I can hold both of those truths at the same time. What she did was wrong. But she was also my mother." Carol reached over and took Rebecca's hand. "We lost 47 years with you," Carol said, her voice thick with emotion. "But we're grateful for every day we have from now on. We're grateful you're alive. We're grateful you found your way back to us." The legal ramifications were complicated. Helen Sinclair was dead, so she couldn't be prosecuted. Raymond Sinclair had genuinely believed the adoption was legitimate, so he wasn't charged with any crime. Vermont had initially processed Rebecca's adoption through legitimate channels, with falsified documents that Helen had somehow obtained. Untangling the legal mess took months. But ultimately, it didn't matter. Rebecca was an adult. She could choose her own identity, her own family, her own life. She chose to keep the name Rebecca, the only name she'd ever known. But she also legally added Harrison to her surname, Rebecca Sinclair Harrison. She visited the Harrisons regularly, built a relationship with them, with David's children, who suddenly had an aunt they'd never known existed. It was messy. There was grief mixed with joy, loss mixed with reunion. Rebecca mourned the parents she'd lost, even as she built relationships with the parents she'd found. Margaret Patterson, who still lived in upstate New York, was informed of the resolution. She cried for hours when she heard. The guilt she'd carried for 47 years didn't disappear, but it shifted somehow. Knowing that Emma was alive, that she'd had a good life, helped in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Detective Leonard Marsh never knew that the case had been solved. He died 17 years before the truth came to light. But his daughter, when she heard the news, visited his grave and whispered, "She's alive, Dad. Emma Harrison is alive. You can rest now." The case that had haunted Millbrook for nearly 5 decades was finally closed. Not in the way anyone had expected. Not with an arrest or a trial or justice served in any conventional sense, but with a truth that was somehow both devastating and miraculous. Emma Rose Harrison had vanished one summer afternoon, stolen by a desperate woman who wanted a child so badly she was willing to destroy lives to have one. But Emma had survived, had thrived, had built a life filled with love and purpose and meaning, even if that life was built on a foundation of lies. And now, impossibly, she'd found her way home. Before we end this incredible story, I need you to understand something. This case represents every family's worst nightmare, but also their greatest hope. For 47 years, Carol and Robert Harrison lived with the unbearable weight of not knowing. And yet, they never gave up hope. They never stopped loving their daughter. And in the end, that love transcended time, distance, and even memory. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the families still searching for their missing loved ones, then do this. Hit that like button right now, subscribe to Cold Case Crimson, and turn on notifications, because these stories matter. These families matter. And the only way we can continue bringing these forgotten cases back into the light is with your support. Share this video with someone who needs to hear Emma's story. Share it, because somewhere out there, another family is still searching. Another family is still hoping. And maybe, just maybe, their story will have a resolution as miraculous as this one. Don't let be the last time you hear from Cold Case Crimson. Subscribe now, because the truth is always worth finding, no matter how long it takes. This is Cold Case Crimson, reminding you that some mysteries do get solved, some families do get closure, and some stories, against all odds, do have happy endings. Thank you for watching.